Value. What is it that makes something or someone valuable? There are special moments in all of our lives, like the birth of a newborn child, or cherishing lifelong memories with an old friend that make moments in our lives golden. There's another meaning to the word value. That, my friends, has to do with currency. Throughout history, there have been several empires that have risen and fallen, which amassed great financial prosperity. What would you do if you were transported back through the ages to any one of these great empires? Take Egypt, for example. How wealthy do you have to be in order to be put in a golden coffin? Consider ancient Babylon, which erected an enormous statue made entirely out of solid gold. The Roman Empire, and its vast power and influence, was so mighty that it taxed the entire then known world. But do you know the identity of the wealthiest nation in existence today? If you guessed the United States, you are mistaken. Though the United States has over 6,000 FDIC insured commercial banks, the most affluent nation happens to be the smallest nation. The Vatican, all things considered, is in fact the wealthiest nation on the planet. Despite being a little over 100 acres in size, the Vatican commands a vast economic and political influence, with most of its gold stored safely inside the Vatican Bank. Located in Vatican City, the main depository for the Vatican's gold is the Federal Reserve. So clearly, the Vatican enjoys its mutual relationship with the Federal Reserve. But how does this information affect all of us personally? Let me ask you this. How do you benefit on an individual level from the Federal Reserve? Most of us who utilize money have no conception of its origin or the manner in which its value can be manipulated. The 2008 financial crisis makes it painfully obvious that American citizens must reevaluate the role that the Federal Reserve plays in unscrupulously controlling money and its quality, because the result will be economic ruin. The Federal Reserve's operations have been described with a plethora of misinformation. Spokesmen for the Federal Reserve claim that, like a golden tool, the Federal Reserve is capable of an array of noble deeds, including stabilizing the business cycle and controlling inflation. But the Federal Reserve's quintessential operation is bringing money into existence out of thin air, with the amounts of said fabricated money varying in proportion in each of the Federal Reserve's creative acts. Now, how does all this tie into the lives of the individual in America? Americans and those who desire economic prosperity should stand at attention at this moment, because the Federal Reserve, as a central bank, has enormous potentiality as a tool to collapse a civilization. The Federal Reserve is the central bank of the United States. Its aims are to manipulate both cash and credit to bring prosperity, not to neighborly American citizens like you and I, but to a select few benefactors and a system that operates under the greatest facade ever perpetrated on American citizens. When was the last time you dwelt upon how the Federal Reserve operates? Here's a quote from Ben Bernanke, former member of the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve, that aptly explains how the Federal Reserve works. The US government has a technology called the printing press, or today, its electronic equivalent, that allows it to produce as many US dollars as it wishes at essentially no cost. By increasing the number of US dollars in circulation, or even by credibly threatening to do so, the US government can also reduce the value of a dollar in terms of goods and services, which is equivalent to raising the prices in dollars of those goods and services. We conclude that under a paper money system, a determined government can always generate higher spending and hence positive inflation.
Because the Federal Reserve can generate illusory money, the illusion of wealth pacifies those who are unfamiliar with the nature of the Federal Reserve, which allows it to fabricate an appearance of material prosperity. This is prosperity in fantasy only, so it is a false sense of security, which is no real protection at all. The United States government and the Federal Reserve have a signature response to economic crisis, namely soothing a so-called shortage of money. Alleviating money shortages does not solve the economic crisis because interest rates at zero and trillions of dollars being pushed into the economy actually make our economic problems worse across time and in the long run. To avoid being victimized by brutal declines in the economy requires all of us to fathom how the monetary system, which induces economic booms and busts, functions.
Imagine a scenario where the United States, for whatever reason, decides that $1 billion is needed. The United States will then issue a bond for that $1 billion, and the bond would subsequently be delivered to the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve, upon receiving the bond, will in turn send out an order for $1 billion to the Department of Printing and Engraving. The Department of Printing and Engraving will then process the order, and within a time frame of about 2 weeks, the bills for the $1 billion are printed and sent over to the Federal Reserve. At last, the Federal Reserve loans the United States the $1 billion with interest. Thus, a vicious cycle is begun as the United States is sent spiraling into debt. Now imagine those $1 billion. Most of us have never come into possession of $1 billion. Now visualize one single dollar bill. When the Federal Reserve loans the United States $1, the United States cannot simply return $1 to the Reserve. They have to first pay back the interest. Thus, when the United States has borrowed so much money that it cannot pay back the interest, this outrageous solution is given: to borrow more money. If the United States continues to borrow money, the only institution that will benefit is the Federal Reserve, because it collects both the dollar and the interest and continues to propagate the United States' downward march to perdition. The march to perdition has led the United States to come under the control of the Federal Reserve. The question that remains for us to dwell on is, how did the United States come to allow the Federal Reserve Bank to control it? The Federal Reserve, by nature, is a central banking system. It must be pointed out that the Federal Reserve is not the one and only central bank that has been set up to control America. Prior to the Federal Reserve, we find 3 precursors. Each bank was originated by a different man, and yet each one had the same goal of dominating the economy of the United States of America. To understand the influence of the modern-day central bank, the Federal Reserve, an understanding of the history of the central banks is necessary.
In the year 1781, Robert Morris proposed the first idea for a central bank. Morris believed that the new nation of America needed a central bank, which should be molded after the Bank of England. About $400,000 was given to fund the bank by anonymous investors. After failing to seize control of the United States economy, the bank ended up shutting down after but 2 short years.
Following the demise of Morris's central bank, his aide, Alexander Hamilton, once again attempted to establish a central bank. In 1790, Hamilton proposed to Congress, calling for a privately owned central bank. The following year, the bill was recognized, and Hamilton's plans came to fruition. This Alexander Hamilton was not the same Alexander Hamilton of 3 years prior, the Hamilton of 1787 who advocated sound money during that year's Constitutional Convention would have opposed his very own bill that he put forth to Congress in 1790. This sudden change in Hamilton's thinking is peculiar because it happened so quickly. Hamilton's bank did not remain unchallenged. It had to contend with another founding father, namely Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson said, "A private central bank issuing the public currency is a greater menace to the liberties of the people than a standing army. We must not let our rulers load us with perpetual debt." Thomas Jefferson continued by saying, "If the American people ever allowed private banks to control the issue of their currency, first by inflation, then by deflation, the banks and the corporations which grow up around them will deprive the people of all property until their children wake up homeless on the continent their fathers conquered." The poignant and apt admonition of Jefferson presented the people with a choice between, as he put it, economy and liberty, or profusion and servitude. Knowing that the central bank would be a means to bankrupt the United States, Jefferson trumpeted, "We are ruined if we do not overrule the principles that the more we owe, the more prosperous we shall be." Jefferson was an advocate of hard money, and Hamilton's bank expired in 1811.
But sharply following the end of the official first central bank, Nicholas Biddle set up the second official central bank of the United States. Biddle was a man who had been tenacious in attempting to establish a central bank in the United States. Nicholas Biddle began his work during the War of 1812 between Britain and the United States. As a result of the war, inflation ensued, but instead of Congress permitting normal conditions to return, Congress approved of a central bank of the United States in the year 1816. Biddle's central bank permitted more expansion and created a boom-bust cycle, a carbon copy of America's first central bank. With the power to create this effect, Biddle's central bank had a powerful advantage over the nation. Congress was in his pocket, and he kept them under his influence by bribing them with money. As the boom-bust cycle continued, it led to the Panic of 1819. The plans created were now growing to their fullest potential, but when the charter for Biddle's bank expired in 1832, the re-elected president, Andrew Jackson, vetoed Congress's attempt to commence another term for the central bank. Jackson's order withdrew the federal government's deposits from Biddle's bank, and the bank closed in 1836.
3 times, the match would be lit. A spark would glow, the embers would ignite, but still the fires of the central banking system would be extinguished. American presidents, in their innermost souls, had a basic desire to preserve the liberty of the United States, whose liberty they felt was threatened by the overcasting shadow of a central banking system. Despite continued efforts to quell the conflagration, America was swept into the firestorm by the Federal Reserve, the autocratic lender whom America the borrower would serve. To return to Thomas Paine's common sense, what business has a continent serving an island? On Jekyll Island, which is off the coast of Georgia, 7 men met together to conjure up a plan to put an end to the financial affluence and prosperity of America. These men were Paul Warburg, representing the Rothschild banking dynasty of Europe, Nelson Aldrich, and Frank Vanderlip, representing the Rockefellers, and lastly, Henry Davison, Charles Norton, and Benjamin Strong, representing J.P. Morgan. Joined under one influence and planning to destroy America, they created the central banking system that we now know as the Federal Reserve.
Their plans were simple: convince Congress and the public that the establishment of a central bank would protect the American people and their money. The 7 men executed the plan as follows. The entire system of the Federal Reserve has been, from its inception, cloaked in secrecy. In fact, its creators would not even refer to it as a cartel or a central bank, and deviously made the Federal Reserve appear to be a government agency, so American people will be duped into accepting its validity. To further the facade of a decentralized structure, the Federal Reserve was not allowed to be overrun by Wall Street banks. The Federal Reserve was not marketed as a potential weaponized system of economic control. In fact, the Federal Reserve's initial policies on the surface were sound until they were further codified in later years. Yet these more malignant policies needed a catalyst, which was found in the frustration of the American people over bank failures or panics. Spurred on by the fear of recent banking flukes, monetary reform became the trending supplication. This entire scheme was given an intellectual glossing as professors at universities were employed to advocate the teachings of the Federal Reserve policies. All that was needed was President Woodrow Wilson's Owen Glass Act of December 23, 1913, to give life unto the creature of Jekyll Island.
The Federal Reserve System was seamlessly oozed into law, and men were purposely stationed at their post at the perfect time. The question is begged, why did Woodrow Wilson, the President of the United States, give the keys of the American economy into the hands of European banking dynasties? Is it possible that Wilson was instructed to do so? If so, then by whom and for what reason? Woodrow Wilson had a personal advisor by the name of Colonel Edward Mandell House. House, due to his connections, not only to the European banking families, but also to J.P. Morgan, was highly influential. House's connections were not limited to the aforementioned. He was also trained in the schools of England and a branch of the Jesuit order, known as the Fabian Society. The Civil War had made House a rich man, and his influence over Wilson was so magnetic that the two had a private code for the telephone which would allow them to have secret communications. President Wilson, speaking of the engrossing influence of House, stated, "Mr. House is my second personality. He's my independent self. His thoughts and mine are one."
The thoughts of President Wilson were not his own. His state of mind, as indicated by his own words, tells of the fact that his mindset was bestowed to him by another power. Could but one man influence a president? Think back to Alexander Hamilton's rapid shift of position. Was there an outside force that was manipulating Hamilton's mindset? Did he undergo a religious conversion, as it were, and then have a rapid shift in his worldview? Here we are brought face to face with the religion of the Federal Reserve. As previously mentioned, House was a member of the Fabian Society, which served as a front group for a religious order known as the Jesuits. Hamilton, in the 1780s, defended the religious order that the Jesuits stood for as well. Does the Jesuit order have anything to do with the founding of the Federal Reserve? If you look back at the foundation of the Federal Reserve on Jekyll Island, we remember that the Rothschilds, Rockefellers, and J.P. Morgan were present at that meeting. These three financial empires are all friendly competitors in Europe. Now, do these banking powers stand on their own, or are they cloaking another power in secrecy?
The power that these banking dynasties are subservient to is none other than the wealthiest principality on the planet, the Vatican. The Rothschilds, according to the Encyclopedia Judaica, bear the very title Guardians of the Vatican Treasury. There is yet another organization, namely the Council on Foreign Relations, that makes it their studied aim to transport the world to the papal Dark Ages once more. Both the Rockefellers and J.P. Morgan are a part of the CFR. What a scam! The smallest nation in the world is pulling the strings of one of the most powerful nations. It has been their desired goal to destroy America, and those who stand up for it. Reading from the Jesuit oath here follows, quote, I do further promise and declare that I will, when opportunity presents, make and wage relentless war, secretly or openly, against all heretics, Protestants, and liberals, as I am directed to do, to extirpate them and exterminate them from the face of the earth, and that I will spare neither age, sex, or condition, and that I will hang, waster, boil, flay, strangle, and bury alive these infamous heretics, rip up the stomachs and wombs of their women, and crush their infants' heads against the walls. That when the same cannot be done openly, I will secretly use the poisoned cup, the strangulating cord, the steel of the poniard, or the leaden bullet, regardless of the honor, rank, dignity, or authority of the person or persons whatsoever may be their condition in life, either public or private, as I at any time may be directed so to do by an agent of the Pope or superior of the Brotherhood of the Holy Faith of the Society of Jesus. End quote.
Many faithful presidents have stood in the face of this murderous institution, and their death warrant was signed with their protest. Andrew Jackson faced the danger of Jesuit assassination because he opposed Nicholas Biddle's central bank. Jackson knew that the Jesuits wanted to dominate and control America, and they could do so through their bankers. Jackson was well aware of the statement made by the Rothschilds' founder, quoting Nathan Meyer Rothschilds, "Who controls the issuance of money controls the government."
This is why when Andrew Jackson ran for a second term, he took his arguments directly to the American people with his campaign slogan, Jackson and no bank. Bankers, because they were fearful of Andrew Jackson, the people's president, poured over $3 million into Republican Senator Clay's opposition campaign. To the disheartenment of the bankers, Andrew Jackson won his re-election, and his first charge was against the central bank. Jackson began by firing 2,000 of the 11,000 employees of the federal government to root out the cloaked agents from the bankers. Following this, Andrew Jackson threw his biggest and most successful punch at the central bank in the year 1832. Biddle's central bank asked Congress 4 years in advance to pass a renewal for the bank's charter. With Congress in the pocket of the Jesuits, Congress compiled and sent the bill to Jackson for signing. President Jackson vetoed the bill with the following words: "It is not our own citizens only who are to receive the boundary of our government. More than 8 million of the stock of the banks are held by foreigners. Is there no danger in our liberty and independence in a bank that in its nature has so little to bind us to our country? Is there not cause to tremble for the purity of our elections in peace and for independence of a country in war? Controlling our currency, receiving our public monies, and holding thousands of our citizens' independence, it would be more formidable and dangerous than a naval and military power of the enemy."
The Jesuits, now furious, went to fulfill their oath. The choice of weapon was the leaden bullet, using their assassin, Richard Lawrence. On January 30th, 1835, Lawrence made an assassination attempt against President Jackson, but only by a miracle did both pistols of Lawrence misfire and fail. To avoid justice from the president, Richard Lawrence claimed insanity, and later, as he was free from punishment, boasted to his friends that if justice was sentenced, he had been in touch with powerful people in Europe that had promised to protect him from punishment should he be caught. Those powerful people were none other than the bankers under the Jesuits' rule. President Andrew Jackson knew that the battle against the central bank had not ended. But as he continued his presidency, he was able to pay off the United States' national debt without the central bank, and he went down in American history as the only president to pay off the nation's debt. The next president, who tried to follow in the steps of Jackson, was assassinated. That next president is none other than President Abraham Lincoln.
Considered to be the greatest American president by historians and laypeople alike, President Abraham Lincoln was also opposed to the creation of a central bank in America, firmly resisting the advances of Rothschild agent August Beltmar to create a central bank. Additionally, Abraham Lincoln, in direct opposition of the policies of debt that central banks advocated, printed $450 million. These bills came to be known as greenbacks because they were printed in green ink on the back of the bill to prevent confusing them with other bills. The federal government printed the bills for no interest, and Abraham Lincoln became the last president to ever issue United States notes debt-free.
Lincoln may have been the last president to issue debt-free money, but he was also the very first American president to fall prey to the assassin's bullet. History reveals that John Wilkes Booth was the man that assassinated the 16th president, Abraham Lincoln. Was John Wilkes Booth a lone killer, or is it possible that he was merely an agent on an assignment?
John Wilkes Booth wasn't the first man to attempt to assassinate Abraham Lincoln. He was simply the first to unfortunately succeed in performing the heinous deed. Abraham Lincoln wasn't wholly unaware of which entity desired to take his life. He knew from whence the persecution was coming. It was coming from the religion of the Federal Reserve. Lincoln's words render his own account as sharp and clear as a reflection in pure waters. Lincoln stated, "So many plots have already been made against my life that it is a real miracle that they have all failed, when we consider that the great majority of them were in the hands of the skillful Roman Catholic murderers, evidently trained by Jesuits. But can we expect that God will make a perpetual miracle to save my life? I believe not. The Jesuits are so expert in those deeds of blood that Henry IV said it was impossible to escape them, and he became their victim, though he did all that could be done to protect himself. My escape from their hands, since the letter of the Pope to Jeff Davis has sharpened the million of daggers to pierce my breast, would be more than a miracle. But just as the Lord heard no murmur from the lips of Moses when he told him that he had to die before crossing the Jordan for the sins of his people, so I hope and pray that he will hear no murmur from me when I fall for my nation's sake."
According to history, the Canadian House of Commons made it clear that it was international bankers who had assassinated Abraham Lincoln. Truthfully, the bankers were only the cloak of secrecy for the order of the Jesuits. Lincoln, prior to being assassinated, said, "The Pope and the Jesuits, with their infernal Inquisition, are the only organized powers in the world which have recourse to the dagger of the assassin to murder those whom they cannot convince with their arguments or conquer with the sword. But it is very certain that if the American people could learn what I know of the fierce hatred of the priests of Rome against our institutions, our schools, our most sacred rights, and our so dearly bought liberties, they would drive them away from among us, or they would shoot them as traitors. But you are the only one to whom I reveal these sad secrets, for I know that you learned them before me." The history of these last 1,000 years tells us that whatever the Church of Rome is not a dagger to pierce the bosom of a free nation, she is a stone to her neck, to paralyze her and prevent her advance in the ways of civilization, science, intelligence, happiness, and liberty.
Commenting on the death of Abraham Lincoln, Charles Chiniquy, a Roman Catholic priest and former client of Lincoln's, charged the Jesuit order for the untimely and cruel passage of the 16th president. But who was that assassin? Booth was nothing but a tool of the Jesuits. It was Rome who directed his arm, after corrupting his heart and damning his soul. Abraham Lincoln was assassinated by the priests and the Jesuits of Rome.
Booth was not alone in his plot to assassinate President Lincoln. John Surratt, Booth's accomplice, fled to Montreal after the death of Lincoln. Lo and behold, John Surratt was found to be a member of the personal army of Pope Pius IX. Pope Pius IX declared himself and the institution for which he stands to be infallible. Compared to the pompous presumption of the Pope, hear the humility in the request of Abraham Lincoln. The only two favors I ask the Lord are, first, that I might die for the sacred cause in which I am engaged, that I am the standard bearer of the rights and liberties of my country. The second favor I ask of God is, that my dear son, Robert, when I am gone, will be one of those who lift up that flag of liberty which will cover my tomb, and will carry it with honor and fidelity to the end of his life, as his father did, surrounded by millions who will be called with him to fight and die for the defense and honor of our country.
The loss that America keenly felt after President Abraham Lincoln's death was heartfelt. Grief did not meet its well-needed end in the 19th century, for the 20th century became the most blood-stained in all of human history. The religion of the Federal Reserve, the Jesuit order, has already proven itself willing to assassinate presidents who refused to flatter their criminal connivings. Abraham Lincoln sought to neutralize the central banking policies. Despite his efforts and his martyrdom, there are more men who still had to sacrifice their mortal life because of their opposition to the religion of the Federal Reserve. These men found themselves aboard a floating palace, a sarcophagus that would soon plunge into icy depths, never to return.
The Titanic's construction began at a shipyard in Belfast, Ireland during the year 1909. The building of the Titanic, which was funded by Jesuit agent J.P. Morgan, was to create a tomb for the wealthy opposition to the Federal Reserve. The opposition to the Federal Reserve were these three men: Benjamin Guggenheim, an American businessman; Isidor Straus, head of the Macy's department stores; and John Jacob Astor, an American real estate builder, inventor, investor, and who at the time may have been the wealthiest man in the world. If the wealth of these men were combined and weighted using the dollar values of our day, they would have an estimated worth of nearly $11 billion at that time.
Because these three men were critics of the Federal Reserve, and due to their financial prowess and ability to halt the progress of the Federal Reserve, these men ended up meeting their demise by sinking in the unsinkable ship. Edward Smith, the Titanic's captain, worked in co-partnership with Jesuit-influenced J.P. Morgan for years. Edward Smith, despite being a man with over 26 years of experience on northern Atlantic routes, was the man who would not only go down with the ship, but be the one to bring the ship to a sinking condition.
Captain Edward Smith made contact with a priest by the name of Francis Brown, who disembarked at Queenstown, Ireland before the Titanic sank. It was likely that Captain Smith received the order to sink the Titanic from priest Francis Brown. Not only was the Titanic ill-equipped with safety materials like lifeboats, but when the Titanic needed to send up a red distress flare, a white party flare was sent up instead. Captain Smith, despite 18 different telegram warnings, propelled the Titanic at 22 knots. Captain Smith was not naive to the danger. He was enhancing it. The Federal Reserve was established the following year in December. Thus, by the year 1912, all opposition to the Federal Reserve was eliminated. Former Congressman Ron Paul wisely pointed out, it is no coincidence that the century of total war coincided with the century of central banking. The Federal Reserve became a war-funding machine whose engine output a total of 2 world wars where millions perished. Ponder that statement. The Federal Reserve's millions of dollars printed translated into millions of lives lost. The Federal Reserve's capability to inflate currency, create both money and credit out of nothing, and its ability to operate under a cloak of secrecy resulted in wars that were rife in bloodshed and catastrophe.
Pandemonium ensues from the Federal Reserve's unstable doctrine of inflation, making it easy for authoritarians to flourish in the chaotic environment. Thus, we have the most blood-stained century in history. Bring back to your memory that the Federal Reserve has a religion, namely the Roman Catholic religion. Consider the words of French historian Edmond Paris. One may say quite specifically that in 1914, the Roman Catholic Church started the series of hellish wars. It was then that the tribute of blood, which she has always taken from the peoples, began to swell into a veritable torrent. Consider the words of another historian, F. Paul Peterson. The Pope was just as much in the Second World War as was Hitler and Catholic Mussolini, and therefore just as guilty of the murder of 6 million Jews. In fact, popes have been in or instigated most, if not all, the European wars down through the centuries.
Additionally, according to historian Avril Manhattan, the whole Vatican-Hitler bargain had been conducted in secret before Hitler became Chancellor of Germany in January 1933. In June of the same year, Hitler and the Vatican signed the Concordat under terms of which the Church swore allegiance to the Nazi regime. Soon afterwards, Catholic von von Papen, the second in command to Hitler, but the essence of the Hitler-Vatican alliance varies succinctly in these words. The Third Reich, he said, is the first power which not only recognizes but puts into practice the high principles of the papacy. One shudders at the horrendous nature of the laws that were put into places in dystopias like Nazi Germany. However, we find that these laws could not have been enforced had it not been for the power of central banking systems. Meyer Rothschild said, "Let me issue and control a nation's money, and I care not who writes the laws." When we look back into history, at the end of World War I, we find that the religious order of the Federal Reserve, the Jesuits, created another front group called the Councils on Foreign Relations, or the CFR. J.P. Morgan initially monopolized the CFR, but later the Rockefellers commanded the CFR. Ultimately, these are all cloaks of secrecy because each of these entities is a front group for the Vatican. The same Vatican ushered in the century of central banking and the century of war.
One does not have to perish in war to fall victim to a bullet. That was the fate of the 35th president. John F. Kennedy was the first Roman Catholic individual to be elected to the United States presidency. In the heart of this man, he had the best interests of the country.
President Kennedy famously said, "Ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country." John F. Kennedy died in the service of the true principles of liberty of conscience. Part and parcel of President Kennedy's plan for the prosperity of the nation was the elimination of the Federal Reserve System. President Kennedy even had non-debt money minted, which did not have the Federal Reserve's mark. It was President Kennedy's commitment to the United States Constitution that eventually led to his savage assassination.
Virtually everyone in United States history that is opposed to central bank has been murdered or has almost had their life expunged. From Congressman McFadden, the businessman on the Titanic, Strauss, Guggenheim, and Astor, and to Presidents Jackson, Lincoln, and even John F. Kennedy. The Vatican is a prime figurehead of the union of church and state. It was this confederacy that President Kennedy stood up against, and it was this confederacy that made sure that Kennedy was not left standing. Kennedy's words are true to this day.
I believe in an America where the separation of church and state is absolute, where no Catholic prelate would tell the president, should he be Catholic, how to act, and no Protestant minister would tell his parishioners for whom to vote, where no church or church school is granted any public funds or political preference, and where no man is denied public office merely because his religion differs from the president who might appoint him or the people who might elect him. I believe in an America that is officially neither Catholic, Protestant, nor Jewish, where no public official either requests or accepts instructions on public policy from the Pope, the National Council of Churches, or any other ecclesiastical source, where no religious body seeks to impose its will, directly or indirectly, upon the general populace or the public acts of its officials, and where religious liberty is so indivisible that an act against one church is treated as an act against all.
President John F. Kennedy was a valuable president whose work was cut short by the Jesuits of Rome. The power of the Catholic Church can hardly be overstated. Once again, here are the words of historian Avro Manhattan. The Catholic Church in the United States financially can stand up to all the giant trusts of America. Politically, she looms ever larger in the White House, in the Senate, and in the Congress. She is a force in the Pentagon, a secret agent in the FBI, and the most subtly intangible prime mover of the Secret Service wheel within a wheel, the Central Intelligence Agency.
Bankers and leaders bow their knees to the Vatican and to the Vatican's leader, Pope Francis. The Pope has been viewed around the world as a humble man of peace, but if he is the leader of one of the most dangerous nations in the world, then his actions must be taken with careful consideration. Pope Francis, in the year 2015, wrote his famous Laudato Si encyclical, and in this book lies the very plan. In the early pages of the encyclical, Pope Francis states that the climate belongs to all and is meant for all because it is a common good. Also, he states that the climate needs urgent support due to the emission of carbon dioxide and other polluting gases that humans have caused. His first solution to reduce those gases is to make it more expensive to purchase them.
The first nation to follow suit was France in November 2018. President Emmanuel Macron raised the price of gas by 7.6 cents per liter, or 30 cents per gallon. The President of France, by doing so, followed through with the command of the Pope. Now, it shouldn't be a surprise because President Macron is a former Rothschild banker and was educated under the Jesuits. In the year 2008, Macron was hired under the Rothschilds and quickly grew from an analyst to a partner. 2 years later, Macron began his campaign to run for president and subsequently earned the nickname the candidate of the Rothschild. Macron was backed by the Vatican and won the election. Pope Francis congratulated their new player and gave Macron the title of first and only honorary canon of St. John Lateran. The honorary canon is a tradition that dates back to the 15th century, which means defender and advocate of the Christian Church and protector of Palestine and of the Catholic faith. The emperor or president sworn in with this title means that they will defend the Catholic Church and her bishops. This is exactly what Macron has been doing. Macron is not a president, but rather a little priest in office to give back to the papacy the power it once had.
This union that France and the papacy are meddling with is a copy of the relationship they had right before the French Revolution. The French Revolution culminated in the year 1798 from the burdened middle and lower classes, while the heavy taxes by the civil authorities and by the clergy fell upon the broken shoulders of the classes. The Jesuits alone flourished in the decaying nation which ruled with dreadful tyranny over churches, schools, and prisons. And all at once, the state was financially embarrassed, and the people exasperated, and it needed no prophet's eye to foresee a terrible, impending outbreak. The French Revolution broke out, and thousands fell by the sword, and blood filled the streets of France. But what was the cause? The adherence to the Pope's orders. Then what will be the outcome if nations listen now? The same pandemonium that happened in France during the French Revolution, and what is currently happening with the Yellow Vests, riots and death. In that encyclical by Pope Francis, he brings to view one more so-called solution to fix the world's problems. Now, will this solution bring peace, or will it bring an ultimate demise?
Politicians and popes alike have long promised a utopia of peace, but always at the expense of personal liberties. Pope Francis claims that there is a way for the world to become rested, less greedy, and more connected and caring. However, this illusion of serenity comes as a result of individuals giving up their liberty to worship God in the way that they choose and submit to the ideologies of Pope Francis. From his encyclical, we find his supposed solution to world problems, which is a plot to turn the United States into a union of church and state, an image to the theocratic government of the Vatican. Pope Francis's Laudato Si declares the following: Sunday, like the Jewish Sabbath, is meant to be a day which heals our relationships with God, with ourselves, with others, and with the world. It, Sunday, protects human action from becoming empty activism. It, Sunday, also prevents that unfettered greed and sense of isolation which makes us seek personal gain to the detriment of all else. The law of weekly rest forbade work on the seventh day. Rest opens our eyes to the larger picture and gives us renewed sensitivity to the rights of others. And so the day of rest, centered on the Eucharist, sheds its light on the whole week and motivates us to greater concern for nature and the poor.
In order for Pope Francis's agenda to be implemented, the government will either have to become the authoritative interpreter of the scripture for all the citizens of the government, or else it will have to put itself in the place of God and authoritatively declare that observances established by the state, in which it calls the Lord's, are the Lord's indeed, although the word of the Lord declares the contrary. Is the United States government ready to take either of these positions? Is the Congress of the United States ready to force the government of the United States to the alternative of taking one or the other of these positions?
Taking either of these positions by the government would be nothing less than for this enlightened nation in this period of the 21st century to assume the place, the power, and the prerogatives of the governments of the Middle Ages in enforcing the dogmas and the definitions of the theologians and executed the arbitrary and despotic will of the Church. Thus, from whatever point the subject of Sunday laws may be viewed, it plainly appears that aside from the papacy, there is no authority whatsoever for Sunday laws or even Sunday keeping, and that the only effect a national Sunday law can ever have will be only evil in that continuing. The Congress now, forever and decidedly, utterly refuse to have anything to do with it in any way whatsoever, and let all the people, instead of sanctioning a movement to bring the national legislation down to the degraded level of the states on this subject, put forth every effort to bring the legislation of the states up to that place where it shall be limited as the power of Congress is limited by the declaration of the national constitution, that it shall make no law respecting the establishment of religion or prohibiting free exercise thereof.
Now, in the name of law, constitutional and statutory, moral and civil, in the name of enlightenment and progress, in the name of reason and the revelation of Jesus Christ, I seriously ask, why should the people of such a nation as this, living under such a constitution as is our national constitution, be asked to return to the papal system of the Dark Ages, which was only the inevitable outcome of the wicked scheme that was conceived in sin, the man of sin, and brought forth in iniquity, the mystery of iniquity in the days of Constantine? Why should such a people as this, dwelling under the best constitution and the most enlightened influences of all ages, be asked to return to the wicked system that characterized the Middle Ages?
No, sir. The noble men who pledged their lives, their fortune, and their sacred honor when they established our Constitution, separated, as they supposed forever, this nation from all the wicked influences of the church and state systems of the colonies, of England, and of all other nations of all times. Under this Constitution, in true liberty, civil and religious, in genuine enlightenment and progress, this nation has certainly stood as the beacon of light for the world for over 200 years. Let this splendid nation ever still look forward and not backwards. Let it still hold its honored place before all the nations, and God forbid that by any such effort that is now being made in behalf of this Sunday law, this glorious nation should be brought down from her high place and made to follow in the papal train.
Ladies and gentlemen, the Federal Reserve should be abolished because it is unconstitutional, depraved, impracticable, extravagantly prodigal, and threatens liberty of conscience. Easily manipulated by its religion, it oppresses both the poor and the middle class by diminishing the value of the dollar by increasing the dollar supply. There is no good that can come from the Federal Reserve.
Ladies and gentlemen, no further argument is needed to show that the Sunday laws of all the states and the principles of the decisions of the Supreme Courts which sustain them are wholly wrong, springing from the papal principle of church and state, and supported by the equally un-American principle of the omnipotence of the legislative power. They are totally subversive of American principles, yet Sunday laws have never been, and can never be, sustained on any other principle. And this is only to say that which is the sum of all this discussion. There is no foundation in justice, in right, or even in expediency for any Sunday laws under any government on this earth.